You've done great work here, Marcus, but the board feels it's time for fresh energy. Today's your last day. My boss, the man who had been named COO 11 months ago, said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, not in a private office, not in a conference room with the door closed, right there, in the middle of the Whitmore Grand's main event floor, 30 minutes before I was supposed to open the most important supplier summit our company had ever hosted. 14 procurement directors, 11 countries, a $1.6 billion consolidated supply agreement sitting in folders on a table 60 feet away. I'm Marcus Webb. I'm 54. I spent 22 years turning a mid-size industrial manufacturer into the kind of company that global suppliers compete to work with. And my boss just handed me a cardboard box in front of the people I built that reputation with. What he didn't know was that I'd seen this coming for 8 months. And what I'd quietly built into that $1.6 billion agreement, he was about to find out the hard way. Let me back up. When I was 32, I left a stable career in mechanical engineering to chase something harder and less predictable global procurement at a company that had no business trying to operate internationally. My colleagues thought I was walking off a cliff. My ex-wife thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe she was right about that part. But I understood something most people didn't. The difference between a good supplier relationship and a great one isn't price. It's trust built over years of small, unglamorous choices. Showing up when something goes wrong, sitting across from a factory owner in Malaysia and actually listening to what he needs. Flying to Stuttgart at Christmas time because a clause needed to be renegotiated before the new year, and I was the only one who knew the history behind it. I learned enough Japanese to negotiate without an interpreter in Osaka. Enough Portuguese to catch the difference between what our Sao Paulo supplier said and what our translator thought they said. A distinction that once saved us $11 million on a single raw materials contract. I became the kind of person that suppliers called directly when something was wrong, because they trusted me more than they trusted the company logo on my business card. By year 10, I had built our supplier network from 14 partners to 61. By year 18, our procurement cost efficiency was ranked in the top 3% of our industry. I wasn't loud about it. Didn't need to be. The numbers spoke without any help from me. Then my boss got hired. He was 33 years old. His name was Tyler, and he came in waving a consulting report about supply chain modernization and AI-driven vendor management. The kind of document that looks impressive on a slide but ignores everything that actually makes a supplier relationship work. The first time I heard the phrase legacy relationship dependency, I almost choked on my coffee. That was his way of saying the supplier relationships I'd built were a liability. That the company was too reliant on trust-based agreements instead of automated platform-managed contracts. He wasn't wrong that the industry was changing. He was wrong about what still mattered inside that change. The second time, it was in a strategy meeting. He said the company needed procurement leadership that understood digital-first operations. Everyone in the room looked at their phones. I looked at him. He didn't look back. I'd been in corporate long enough to know what that meant. I started paying closer attention. 8 months ago, I was asked to lead the most ambitious project of my career, consolidating 61 supplier relationships into a streamlined network of 22 anchor partners. The result would be a 5-year, $6 billion agreement that would lock in pricing, output guarantees, and quality standards across every major product line. It was the kind of project that would define whoever's name was attached to it. I understood that clearly. I also understood, by then, that my boss planned to make sure that name wasn't mine. I'd seen the internal memos he forgot I was still copied on. I'd caught the reorganization draft with my role listed under transition roles. I'd heard through my assistant, a sharp woman named Denise, who had worked with me for 9 years, that my boss had already scheduled onboarding conversations with a candidate to take my position. I thought about the Shanghai negotiation, where I caught the mistranslation. About the Munich clause I rewrote at 2 a.m. About the 14 supplier relationships I'd personally maintained through my daughter's childhood, through my divorce, through the years when the only constant in my life was the work. My daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner. I missed it. Conference call with Osaka. She told me at the reception that she'd stopped being surprised by things like that, which was worse than if she'd been angry. I sat in my office one Tuesday night, staring at the preliminary framework for the consolidation agreement, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight him publicly. I wasn't going to campaign for my own job, but I was going to make sure that if he tried to push me out, the cost would be something he couldn't spin, couldn't manage, and couldn't undo. The first thing I built was what I called the continuity provision. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't aggressive. In fact, on its face, it looked like responsible risk management, the kind of language that makes lawyers comfortable. The provision stated that any consolidated supplier agreement under this framework required verification of relationship continuity with the named procurement lead before final execution. If the named lead was removed, resigned, or reassigned within 90 days of signing, all anchor partner commitments would revert to their previous individual contract terms at the previous rates, the previous timelines, and the previous scope. In plain language, if I was removed before the ink dried, the $1.6 billion consolidation unwound automatically, not renegotiated, unwound. Every anchor partner would walk back to their old agreements, and the company would lose everything the new framework had gained. I didn't present it as self-protection. I presented it as supplier security. When I talked to my contact in Osaka, a man I'd worked with for 11 years, who once flew to Chicago specifically because I'd asked him to, I framed it in terms of relationship investment. You're committing 5 years based on continuity of trust, I told him. This provision protects your commitment. If the relationship changes, you're not locked in under false pretenses. He understood exactly what I was asking. He agreed immediately. When I spoke with my contact in Stuttgart, I used the language he responded to: risk mitigation, contract integrity, liability exposure. He called it sensible. When I spoke to my counterpart in Monterey, I talked about what happens when companies shuffle leadership mid-process and suppliers get left holding agreements that nobody on the new team understands. He'd been burned before. He didn't need convincing. One by one, 11 of the 14 anchor partners reviewed and approved the provision. It was embedded in paragraph 12 of the master framework, underneath the boilerplate about dispute resolution. My boss signed off on the framework summary. He never read paragraph 12. The second layer was simpler and more personal. Every executed version of the anchor partner agreements required a biometric authorization from the named procurement lead. The system had been in place for 3 years, designed after a near miss, where a falsified approval almost cost us $8 million. My boss inherited the system. He never questioned it. He probably didn't know the details existed. Without my authorization, the documents were valid in appearance but unenforceable in execution. Legally, they were placeholders. My boss thought he was 6 hours away from closing the biggest deal in company history. He was 6 hours away from the worst day of his professional life. The morning of the summit, I arrived at the Whitmore Grand at 6:30. I set up the main event floor, the way I'd set up 100 rooms before its seating chart reviewed, translation equipment tested, binders confirmed, coffee service timed. Denise texted me at 7. He brought someone with him. She's in the lobby. I knew who she was, my replacement. 30 years old, fresh from a consulting firm that had never managed a real supplier relationship in its life. Her credentials looked excellent on paper. In this room, with these people, she would last about 20 minutes before the questions started. I adjusted my jacket, reviewed the seating one more time, walked into the room like nothing had changed. 30 minutes before the session was supposed to begin, my boss found me near the presentation screen. His voice was level, deliberate, the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed a conversation they were enjoying too much. You've done great work here, Market, but the board feels it's time for fresh energy. Today's your last day. He wanted the room to hear it. I could tell by the way he hadn't lowered his voice, by the way he'd chosen this moment over a dozen quieter options. He wanted my removal to be his opening statement, his signal to the suppliers, to the staff, to anyone watching, that a new era had arrived, and it arrived on his terms. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit there between us. Across the room, my contact from Osaka caught my eye. He gave me a look I recognized, not surprise, not sympathy, understanding. He'd suspected something like this might happen. I'd told him enough for him to read the room. I picked up my briefcase. The leather was cracked at the corners from years of airport floors and overhead compartments. Inside was a small security module, matte black, about the size of a deck of cards. My boss didn't know it existed. It held the biometric key to every anchor partner agreement on that table. I said, quietly, "All right, Tyler," and I walked toward the door. I didn't rush. I didn't look back at him. I pushed through the side exit and stood in the carpeted hallway for a moment, listening to the hum of the HVAC and the distant sound of the main floor starting to fill with people. Then I heard chairs scraping. Not one. Several. I stood still. Through the door, I could hear my boss calling the session to order. His voice had that particular brightness people use when they're performing confidence. He introduced himself as the executive lead. He talked about the company's vision for the next 5 years. He used the words transformation and scalable and next-generation procurement infrastructure. I'd heard all of it before. Then he went quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means someone asked a question he wasn't expecting. I pressed my ear closer to the door. My contact from Stuttgart had spoken. I knew his voice measured, direct, with the kind of precision that cuts through everything unnecessary. He was asking about Clause 12 of the Master Framework. Specifically, he wanted confirmation that the named procurement lead had authorized the final execution structure. My boss said the team was fully aligned on the framework. My contact from Stuttgart said that wasn't what he'd asked. A second voice, my contact from Seoul, a man I'd visited twice a year for a decade, said something shorter. I didn't catch every word, but I caught the last part. We understood Marcus Webb was the named lead on these agreements. Is that still accurate? The room went quiet. I could picture exactly what was happening on the other side of that door. The 14 supplier directors, some of whom had flown 17 hours to be in that room, were doing the math in real time. These weren't people who panicked. They were people who calculated. And what they were calculating right now was the exposure created by a leadership change 30 minutes before signing. My boss tried to move forward. He said the framework stood on its own merits, independent of any individual team member. He said the company's commitment was institutional, not personal. My contact from Osaka spoke next. His English was precise and unhurried. He said, simply, that per the continuity provision in paragraph 12, the anchor commitments were contingent on the named lead's participation through execution. He said this not as a complaint, just as a fact. The way you read a weather report. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. I heard a folder close, the soft snap of a leather portfolio, the deliberate sound of a pen being set down on a hard surface. My contact from Monterey said something in Spanish to his interpreter. I heard his chair move. Someone near the back of the room asked a staff member for their coat. My boss's voice started to lose its shape. He said they could resolve any concerns. He said the framework was sound. His sentences got shorter, and the space between them got longer. And that particular ratio tells you everything you need to know about how a room is turning. A second chair scraped against the floor, then a third. I stayed in the hallway. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. What I'd built 6 months ago was already doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not punish anyone, not sabotage anything, just make the truth unavoidable. These 14 people hadn't flown in from 11 countries to sign agreements with a man they'd never met. They'd come because of what had been built over 22 years. And if that was being removed from the table, then so was their commitment. The door opened. My contact from Stuttgart walked out first. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. He stopped when he saw me. He extended his hand. His grip was exactly as firm as it had been the first time we shook hands in Munich, 14 years ago. He said, in English, "You were the agreement, Marcus. You understand that." I told him I did. He nodded once and walked toward the elevator. My contact from Osaka came next. He stopped beside me. He said, quietly, "Lawrence-san," and then caught himself and laughed once, very softly. He said, "My apologies. Marcus, we would like to continue this process. With you, through your own firm, if necessary." I said I'd be in touch. He bowed slightly and followed toward the elevator. One by one, the hallway filled. Some stopped, some just nodded as they passed. My contact from Sao Paulo touched my shoulder briefly without breaking stride. My contact from Kuala Lumpur said, in Malay, something that roughly translates to, "We'll find a way." I told him we would. Inside the room, I could hear my boss making calls. His voice had gone from controlled to frantic in the span of about 4 minutes, which is faster than I expected. He was talking to legal, then to HR, then to someone on the board. I heard the word override twice. I heard the phrase, force execution. Our chief legal officer's voice came through a speakerphone. I recognized it. She'd been with the company 15 years. Her tone was the same as it always was when someone senior was trying to do something inadvisable. Calm, final. "Tyler, the biometric authorization is hard-coded into the execution system. We can't override it without a court order, and even if we could, the continuity provision would still void 11 of the 14 agreements retroactively. There is no path forward on this framework without Marcus's involvement." A pause. Then, "How did this get into the agreement?" Another pause. Longer, because he put it there. "And you signed the framework summary." I walked toward the lobby. The cold air hit me when I pushed through the hotel's front doors. I stood on the granite steps for a moment, watching a cab move slowly through downtown traffic. The morning felt unusually quiet. My phone buzzed. My contact from Osaka, Marcus. We would like to formalize what I said inside. Independent consultancy arrangement, full authority, compensation above your current package. We trust you to name fair terms. I read it twice. Then it buzzed again. My contact from Stuttgart. If you're establishing your own practice, we want to be your first retained client. Call me when you're ready. Then a message from a number I didn't recognize at first until I remembered it was the direct line of a regional director from a fourth supplier I'd spent months cultivating. Heard what happened. We're prepared to proceed under whatever structure you're leading, not the one you were with. 3 messages. 11 minutes after, I'd walked out of that room with a cardboard box and a biometric security module. I stood on those steps for a while, let the city noise wash over me, thought about my daughter's rehearsal dinner, and the graduation I'd called in to instead of attending, and the years I'd given to a company that had just tried to end my career in front of an audience. I also thought about the $1.6 billion sitting on that table, going nowhere. Then I thought about what comes next. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Whitmore Grand. I go there sometimes when I need to think without being interrupted. I sat down, ordered black coffee, opened my laptop, and started drafting the founding documents for a new firm. I named it Webb Procurement Partners. I'm not going to pretend the transition was painless. There were weeks of legal back and forth. My former employer tried to invoke a non-solicitation clause before their own attorneys pointed out that the suppliers had approached me, not the other way around. The continuity provision held up under scrutiny because it had been designed by someone who understood the law better than anyone who tried to attack it. My contact from Stuttgart introduced me to his firm's legal team. My contact from Osaka connected me with 2 institutional investors who'd been watching the consolidation project fall apart and wanted to understand how to salvage it under a different structure. My contact from Monterey sent a referral that turned into my 4th retained client within the first 6 weeks. 4 months after the Whitmore Grand, I'm sitting in an office I signed a lease on myself. 12th floor, corner suite, view of the river. The desk isn't impressive. I bought it secondhand from an office liquidation sale, but it's mine. That part matters more than it probably should. Last week, I finalized a restructured version of the original consolidation framework. Different legal architecture. Cleaner terms. 9 of the original 14 anchor partners signed on. The aggregate value came in at $1.85 billion, larger than what my boss tried to execute, built on the same relationships he'd called a liability. My contact from Stuttgart flew in for the signing. He brought a bottle of Riesling from the region where we'd negotiated our first deal together in 2011. We drank it in paper cups because I hadn't bought real glasses yet. It was the best wine I've had in years. Before he left, he reached into his jacket and set something on the desk. A pen, the one he'd left behind on the table at the Whitmore Grand, capped, ink tip facing away from him when he stood up and walked out. I'd known what that gesture meant. He knew I'd known. "You should have it," he said. I picked it up, felt the weight of it. Why? Because that table needed someone honest at it. That was you. It was always you. He shook my hand and left. I set the pen in the center of my desk. I look at it sometimes when I'm on a call, or working through a difficult clause, or just sitting in the early morning before anyone else comes in. It doesn't mean anything to anyone else, but it means something to me. As for my boss, I heard he lasted 8 weeks after the Whitmore disaster. The board had video, documented supplier withdrawals, and a legal analysis showing that a poorly executed leadership transition had cost the company north of $200 million in lost contract value. He resigned before they could fire him. Last I heard, he's doing independent consulting work. Small clients. No one who requires him to understand paragraph 12. My daughter came to visit the new office last month. She stood at the window looking at the river for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "This looks like something that's actually yours." I told her it was. She asked if I was done missing things. I told her I was working on it. She nodded, didn't push further. That's her way. She gives you room to prove things over time rather than demanding them up front. She got that from her mother. It's the best trait either of them has. There's a lesson somewhere in all of this, though I'm not the type who enjoys packaging things neatly. But if I had to say it plainly, the relationships you build with integrity, the ones where you showed up when it was inconvenient, learned the language, caught the mistake, no one else was awake enough to catch those relationships, don't belong to a company. They belong to you. They travel with you. They wait for you. A logo doesn't build trust. Time does. Consistency does. Showing up in a factory in Osaka at 6 in the morning because that's when the owner is most willing to talk, that does. What my boss understood about procurement could fit on a slide deck. What I understood had been learned in rooms that will never make it into a slide deck. And in the end, the only person surprised by the outcome was him. When it was time to sign the new agreement, the conference room went quiet the way rooms do when something significant is about to happen without fanfare. No cameras. No photographer positioned for the best angle of a leadership refresh. Just 14 people who had traveled a long way because they trusted the person sitting at the head of the table. I uncapped the pen. I signed my name at the top of the page, not buried in a footnote, not listed as former lead or advisory participant. Right at the top, where it had always belonged. Chief Procurement Advisor. Webb Procurement Partners. I capped the pen, set it down in front of me, let the room stay quiet for one more moment. Then I looked up, and I got back to work.